On a stretch of South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, there is an absence. It is not a ruin of stone and twisted metal, but a more profound emptiness, a scar on the urban grid where a monument to power once stood. Here, the air itself seems to hold the weight of a story that has been physically erased, leaving behind only the quiet hum of traffic and the indifference of a city that has long since moved on. What was once the address of an unofficial capital is now just a coordinate, a ghost in the city's memory. Before it was nothing, it was a 10-story behemoth of brick and terracotta, a fortress disguised as a hotel. The Lexington, as it was known in its prime, projected an image of Gilded Age respectability, its ornate facade a stoic witness to the roaring pulse of the city. But by the end, its grandeur had curdled into dereliction. Its name had changed, its purpose had blurred, and its structure had begun the slow, inexorable process of surrender to time and neglect. In its final years, it was a hollowed-out carcass, windows gaped like vacant eyes, their glass long shattered by stones, or the relentless Chicago wind. The elegant terracotta that once spoke of prosperity was stained with grime and tattooed with the spray-painted signatures of those who sought shelter within its decaying walls. A faint scent of damp rot and forgotten lives clung to the air, a funereal perfume for a building that had already died but refused to fall. This architectural corpse, however, held a legend. It was whispered that within its labyrinthine corridors and behind its crumbling plaster lay the secrets of an empire built on violence and illicit desire. The structure was more than a building. It was an artifact, a physical ledger of a time when one man held the city in his grip. Its decay was not just a matter of material failure, but the slow decomposition of a myth. This myth proved too potent to be left to the wrecking ball without one final ceremony. In 1986, the ruin was reanimated by the glare of television lights. A nation was invited to witness a televised excavation, a modern treasure hunt broadcast live. The promise was intoxicating, to peel back the layers of concrete and time and uncover a secret vault, a hidden chamber belonging to the hotel's most infamous resident, Al Capone. The event was a spectacle of manufactured suspense. Hosted by a journalist who staked his reputation on the discovery, the broadcast framed the excavation as a form of historical justice. It was a chance to finally see the tangible proof of a gangster's fortune, to touch the hidden heart of his power. For 2 hours, an audience of millions watched as drills whined and demolition experts prepared to breach the hotel's long silent basement. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective holding of breath as a small charge of dynamite blew open the sealed concrete wall. Dust billowed out like a released spirit, clouding the camera lens. Here, deep in the building's foundations, was a space untouched for over half a century, a time capsule from the zenith of the Chicago outfit. This was not just about finding money, it was about finding a definitive answer to a legend. But as the dust settled and the cameras pushed into the darkness, the great revelation was one of profound anticlimax. The vault was not filled with gold bars, stacks of cash, or incriminating ledgers. It contained nothing more than dirt, a few empty bottles, and the debris of its own construction. The sanctum of America's most notorious gangster was a void. The empty vault became a national punchline, a symbol of media hype and public disappointment. Yet, in its emptiness, it offered a more truthful and devastating metaphor than any treasure could have. It suggested that the core of this criminal empire, for all its material excess and terrifying influence, was ultimately hollow. Its power was an illusion, a grand performance that, when stripped of its mystique, left nothing behind. The broadcast was the hotel's last pathetic encore. After the cameras left, the building was returned to its silence and its fate. There were no more secrets to seek, no more legends to chase. Its value, both historical and monetary, had been exhausted. The structure was now just an obstacle, a dangerous relic occupying valuable real estate. The end came not with a bang, but with the methodical crunch of the wrecking ball. One floor at a time, the fortress was unmade. Walls that had absorbed the whispers of conspiracy, floors that had supported the weight of absolute power, and secret passages that promised escape were all reduced to a mountain of rubble. The physical evidence of an era was systematically pulverized. Today, the site is a testament to the impermanence of empires built on fear. The ground where the Lexington once stood is flat, anonymous, absorbed back into the city's fabric. The fortress is gone, its secrets turned to dust and carried away by the wind. It exists only as a phantom, a story of a monument to invincibility that vanished completely. But what the hotel concealed in its prime was far more substantial than what the vault revealed in its ruin. The story of its construction is the story of a man's ascent from the gutter to the throne, and the walls themselves were the silent witnesses to his reign. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To understand the void left behind, we must first reconstruct the fortress that filled it. If you wish to uncover the secrets that were built into its very foundation, subscribe and continue this journey into the heart of a fallen empire. Before the fortress, there was the man. And before the man became a myth, he was just a boy from Brooklyn, born into the friction of a new century and the hard realities of an immigrant neighborhood. Alphonse Capone was forged not in the boardrooms he would later command, but in the crucible of the New York streets, a world where respect was a currency earned with fists and a quick mind. It was here that the initial lines of his character were drawn, a deep-seated ambition, a suspicion of authority, and an early understanding that the line between law and crime was porous. His education was not one of letters, but of survival. He learned the brutal arithmetic of power in the 5 Points Gang, an apprenticeship in violence and illicit enterprise. It was in a brawl in a Coney Island dive that his face was slashed, leaving him with the 3 scars that would become part of his legend. This physical mark was a permanent reminder of a lesson learned early. Vulnerability was a weakness to be armored, and an attack must always be met with overwhelming force. The future fortress was already being designed in his mind, long before he had the bricks and mortar to build it. Chicago was the next chapter, a summons from his mentor, Johnny Torrio. The city was a different beast from New York, sprawling, raw, and seething with an energy that was both industrial and criminal. It was a city of broad shoulders and open palms, a place where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed. For a young man with Capone's specific talents, Chicago was not just a new territory. It was a blank canvas, a kingdom waiting for a king. Torrio was the architect of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but he operated with an old-world discretion. He taught Capone the intricacies of the business, the management of brothels, the nuances of illegal gambling, the delicate art of bribing politicians and police. Capone absorbed it all, but a different vision was beginning to form within him. He saw the potential for something grander, an empire run not like a back-alley racket, but like a modern corporation. The catalyst for this vision was a single act of legislation. The 18th Amendment, intended to usher in an era of sobriety and moral rectitude, did the opposite. Prohibition created an economic vacuum of staggering proportions, turning the nation's thirst for alcohol into a river of illicit cash. Suddenly, the petty crimes of the past were dwarfed by an industry worth millions. It was a historical accident that perfectly matched the scale of Capone's ambition. He understood what the lawmakers did not. You cannot legislate desire. While the old guard saw bootlegging as a lucrative but dangerous side business, Capone saw it as the foundation of an empire. He applied his innate organizational genius to the problem, building supply chains, distribution networks, and a system of enforcement that was ruthlessly efficient. He wasn't just selling whiskey, he was building a brand. The transfer of power was as swift as it was brutal. When a rival gang attempted to assassinate Torrio in 1925, the elder statesman saw the writing on the wall. He survived, but his nerve was broken. He handed the keys to his burgeoning empire to his young protege and retired, leaving the 26-year-old Capone as the undisputed ruler of Chicago's underworld. The apprentice had become the master. With absolute control, Capone's true nature was unleashed. He was not content to be a hidden puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows. His narcissism demanded a stage. He began to cultivate a public persona, that of a charismatic businessman, a benefactor who provided a service the public desperately wanted. He gave interviews to reporters, attended operas, and dressed in flamboyant, custom-tailored suits. He was crafting an image of legitimacy, a mask for the sociopathic brutality that lay beneath. This duality, the public figure and the private monster, required a specific kind of space. An empire needed a capital, and a celebrity needed a palace. A hidden warehouse or a nondescript office in a quiet part of town would not suffice. Such a choice would be an admission of shame, an acknowledgement that his business was illegitimate. Capone's ego demanded the opposite. He needed a headquarters that was as bold, visible, and defiant as he was. His ambition was architectural. He envisioned a command center that would not only serve the practical needs of his vast operation, but would also function as a powerful symbol. It had to project strength, luxury, and above all, untouchability. It needed to be a place where he could be seen by the public while remaining utterly inaccessible to his enemies and the law. He sought a building that could be both a throne room and a fortress. He found it on South Michigan Avenue. The Lexington Hotel was perfect. It was not some newly constructed edifice built with dirty money, but an established landmark, a 10-story monument of brick and terracotta that carried an air of old-world respectability. To occupy it was not merely to find a base of operations. It was to conquer a piece of the legitimate world and remake it in his own image. The choice was a calculated act of psychological warfare. By setting up his headquarters in a grand hotel on a major city thoroughfare, Capone was issuing a public declaration. He was stating without words that he was not hiding. He was a permanent fixture of the city, as solid and immovable as the building he now occupied. He was daring the authorities to challenge him on his own ground. This was the birth of the fortress, not as a structure of defense born of fear, but as a monument to arrogance. His paranoia was a factor, but it was secondary to his vanity. He would later riddle the hotel with armored doors, secret passages, and steel shutters, but these were additions to a structure whose primary purpose was symbolic. It was a projection of power. He did not build the Lexington, he colonized it. He took over entire floors, evicting other tenants and beginning a process of transformation that would turn a public hotel into a private citadel. The elegant suites were converted into offices, the corridors became arteries of his criminal network, and the very air of the place began to shift, charged with the presence of its new master. The hotel's original identity began to erode, overwritten by the force of Capone's will. Its Gilded Age facade now concealed a modern criminal enterprise, its lobbies patrolled by men with unseen holsters, its switchboards controlled by operators who served a new kind of guest. The building was becoming a physical extension of Capone himself, a respectable exterior hiding a meticulously organized and violent core. The dream of power was no longer an abstract ambition. It was being rendered in plaster, steel, and concrete. Each renovation, each newly fortified room, was another sentence in the story he was telling the world. The Lexington Hotel was ceasing to be just a building. It was becoming the materialization of an obsession, the architectural blueprint of a mind that saw itself as an empire. The transformation began not with a demolition, but with an infiltration. Capone's men did not arrive with sledgehammers. They arrived with suitcases and briefcases, checking in as guests before becoming permanent fixtures. The hotel's grand lobby, designed for the rustle of silk dresses and the low murmur of polite society, slowly absorbed a new kind of energy. The air grew heavier, charged with the quiet confidence of men who knew the rules no longer applied to them. This initial occupation was a masterpiece of subtle conquest. The hotel staff, the bellhops, the clerks, the switchboard operators found themselves serving a new, undeclared management. Their loyalty was not demanded. It was simply purchased or coerced, a gradual transfer of allegiance that left the building's ownership intact on paper, but fundamentally altered in reality. The Lexington was still a hotel, but it was no longer a public space. It had become a vessel being hollowed out from the inside. Power was concentrated vertically. The lower floors were allowed to maintain a semblance of normalcy, a buffer zone between the outside world and the true seat of command. But to ascend in the hotel's ornate elevators was to cross a border. The 4th and 5th floors became a sovereign territory, a state within a state, accessible only to the initiated. Here the laws of Chicago were suspended, replaced by the singular will of one man. This private kingdom was built at considerable expense, a $100,000 renovation that remade the hotel's Gilded Age interior into a hybrid of corporate headquarters and royal court. The walls were replastered, the floors laid with new carpets, and the wiring redone to accommodate a private communications network. This was not just redecorating, it was the fortification of a conquered space, the architectural equivalent of planting a flag. At the heart of this domain was Suite 530, Capone's personal sanctuary. It was a space designed to soothe a restless and paranoid mind, decorated in incongruously soft shades of green and lavender. Light filtered through windows that offered a commanding view of Michigan Avenue, a daily reminder of the city that lay at his feet. The furniture was opulent, the rugs Persian, but the comfort it offered was a carefully constructed illusion. Every object in the suite was a symbol of his arrival. The bathroom was a study in grotesque luxury, its fixtures plated in gold, its bathtub custom-built to accommodate his large frame. This was not the practical indulgence of old money, but the defiant proclamation of the new. It was a throne room disguised as a washroom, a place where the grime of his origins could be symbolically cleansed with the most expensive soap and water. Adjacent to this personal space, the nature of the rooms shifted dramatically. More than a dozen suites were stripped of their residential character and converted into a sterile, efficient corporate nerve center. Desks replaced beds, and the gentle chime of a service bell was supplanted by the incessant clatter of teletype machines and the ringing of private telephone lines. Here, the business of the empire was conducted with brutal efficiency. This was the engine room of the outfit. Accountants sat in what were once bedrooms, meticulously laundering millions of dollars in illicit revenue through a complex web of front businesses. Lawyers strategized in former sitting rooms, finding loopholes and bribing officials to keep the machine running. It was a factory of crime, its assembly line producing not goods, but corruption and control. Yet this entire corporate facade was itself a mask for a deeper, more primal function. The Lexington was not just a command center, it was a fortress. The opulence of Suite 530 and the business-like hum of the offices were the soft outer layers protecting a hardened core of steel and concrete. The first hint of this reality was in the windows. They were not ordinary glass. With the flip of a switch, heavy steel shutters, once hidden within the walls, could descend, hermetically sealing the suite from the outside world. In seconds, a room with a panoramic view of the city could become a windowless, impregnable bunker. The message was clear. The world could be observed and controlled, but it would not be allowed to penetrate. The doors were another layer of this defense. They were clad in steel and fitted with complex locks, designed to withstand not just a burglar's jimmy, but a battering ram or a burst of machine gun fire. To enter Capone's inner sanctum was to pass through a series of hardened checkpoints, each one a testament to his profound and abiding fear of betrayal. This paranoia was woven into the very fabric of the building. The renovation had not just added armor, it had created a secret anatomy. Hidden panels in the walls, false closets, and concealed doorways were everywhere. A wardrobe in Capone's suite was rumored to conceal a secret staircase that led down through the building, a private escape route for an emperor who always planned for his own exile. This network of passages was his ultimate insurance policy. It was said to connect his floors not only to the basement, but also to tunnels that led to adjacent buildings, offering multiple escape vectors in the event of a raid or an attack by rivals. He had turned the hotel into a labyrinth of which he was the only master, a physical manifestation of his own cunning and distrust. The hotel's own systems were weaponized. The central switchboard was no longer a neutral service for guests. It was an intelligence-gathering hub. Controlled by Capone's men, it allowed them to monitor the calls of every person in the building, from visiting politicians to federal agents who might be foolish enough to stay there. The building's ears belonged to him. The Lexington also functioned as the outfit's treasury. While the location of the main vault remains a subject of legend, it is certain that the hotel was a conduit for immense sums of cash. Safes were hidden behind paintings and inside walls, temporary holding pens for the river of money that flowed in from speakeasies, brothels, and gambling dens before being washed clean by the accountants upstairs. The luxury was a tool of diplomacy and intimidation. Lavish parties were a common occurrence. events where the lines between the underworld and the upper world blurred. Politicians, judges, and reporters mingled with hitmen and racketeers, all enjoying Capone's food and illegal liquor. These were not celebrations. They were exercises in power, designed to remind the city's elite who truly held the reins. Within this environment of forced conviviality, information was the most valuable currency. A careless word from a drunken official, a whispered tip from a journalist on the payroll, all of it was collected, sorted, and stored for future use. The parties were a beautiful, glittering spider's web, and Capone sat at its center, feeling the vibrations of the entire city. But beneath the veneer of celebration and business, the hotel had a darker, unspoken purpose. Its transient nature, the constant flow of anonymous faces, made it the perfect stage for disappearances. Enemies of the outfit, traitors from within, or rivals who refused to be bought, could be brought to the hotel and never be seen again. The building's thick walls and labyrinthine basement offered endless possibilities for interrogation and execution, far from the prying eyes of the law. While never proven, the logic of the underworld suggests the Lexington was not just a palace, but also a tomb, its foundations absorbing secrets that were far more grim than hidden money. The hotel had become a living organism, a perfect extension of its master's psyche. Its public facade was the charismatic, respectable businessman Capone presented to the press. Its luxurious suites were his narcissism and ego, rendered in silk and gold. Its corporate offices were his organizational genius, a model of criminal efficiency. Its armored core, however, was the truest reflection. The steel shutters, the secret passages, the constant surveillance, these were the architecture of his sociopathic paranoia. They revealed a man who, despite being at the pinnacle of his power, lived in a state of perpetual siege, trusting no one and fearing the inevitable attack. The building was a weapon, its very location on a major avenue a daily act of defiance against the authorities. It was a constant, visible declaration that he was above the law, an embassy for an empire that operated in plain sight. Its sheer mass and solidity projected an image of permanence and invincibility. It was also a mask. The trappings of a luxury hotel, the uniformed staff, the elegant decor, the pretense of serving the public, provided a crucial layer of camouflage. It allowed the most dangerous criminal organization in the country to operate not from a shadowy lair, but from a legitimate address, blurring the line between crime and commerce. And finally, it was a refuge, but a deeply pathological one. It was not a home that offered peace, but a bunker that promised survival. The more powerful Capone became, the more he sealed himself inside his creation. The fortress designed to protect him from the world also served to isolate him within it, a gilded cage of his own making. The structure on South Michigan Avenue was no longer the Lexington Hotel. It was a complex, multi-layered entity that breathed with the life of the Chicago outfit. It was a command post, a bank, a boardroom, and a broadcasting station for the myth of Al Capone. Its walls were his armor. Its corridors were the arteries of his empire, through which flowed cash, information, and orders for life and death. The building was complicit, its original purpose wholly subverted to serve the needs of organized crime. It had become a silent, stone accomplice. The concrete and terracotta did more than house an empire. They defined it. The Lexington gave Capone's power a physical address, a tangible reality that made it seem all the more absolute. It was the ultimate symbol of his reign, a monument built not just of brick, but of arrogance, fear, and an unquenchable thirst for control. One might ask which of these creations was the truest reflection of the man's soul: the opulent suite that served as his public throne, the cold efficiency of the offices that managed his wealth, or the hidden armored passages born of pure paranoia. What do you believe best symbolizes the vanity of a man who builds a fortress he believes no one can breach? The reign was absolute, and the Lexington Hotel was its throne. At its zenith, the building was no longer a structure of brick and mortar, but a living organism, its systems and corridors fused with the will of its master. The grand facade on South Michigan Avenue projected an unassailable confidence. a monument to an empire that operated not in the shadows, but under the full glare of the city's lights. Inside, every detail from the placement of a guard to the thread count of the sheets was an expression of calculated, absolute control. This was not a headquarters, it was a capital, the administrative and spiritual center of a parallel government. The daily rhythm of the empire was dictated from Suite 530. Mornings began not with the rising sun, but with the arrival of Capone's lieutenants, men who governed territories of violence and vice. They entered the suite with reports and left with orders, their movements setting in motion the vast and intricate machinery of the outfit. From this lavender and green room, liquor shipments were rerouted, rival territories were absorbed, and the fates of men were decided with a quiet nod. The city of Chicago, in its entirety, was a chessboard, and this room was the only place from which the entire board could be seen. Information was the lifeblood of this kingdom, and the hotel was its heart, pumping intelligence through a network of private arteries. The incessant chatter of teletype machines from the corporate offices was the sound of power being exercised in real time. Coded messages detailed police patrol schedules, the cargo of incoming ships, and the private indiscretions of public officials. Every phone call that passed through the hotel's switchboard was a potential asset. Every whispered conversation in the lobby, a piece of a larger puzzle. The building listened, and what it heard was transformed into leverage. The cash arrived in a constant, silent tide. It came in leather briefcases carried by trusted collectors, in laundry bags from the front businesses, in armored cars that pulled up to discreet side entrances. This was the raw material of the empire, the physical product of a nation's thirst and its hypocrisy. The bills, still smelling of the speakeasies and gambling dens from which they were taken, were counted in back rooms by men who worked with the dispassionate speed of bank tellers. The sheer volume was a logistical challenge, a river of currency that had to be channeled and cleansed before it could be used. In the converted suites of the 4th and 5th floors, this raw wealth underwent a metamorphosis. A quiet army of accountants, led by the financial genius Jake Guzik, performed a kind of corporate alchemy. They took the chaotic flow of street money and, through a labyrinth of ledgers and a constellation of shell corporations, transformed it into legitimate investments. Laundromats, real estate holdings, union contracts, each was a dam and a filter, slowing the illicit current and rendering it indistinguishable from the clean waters of American commerce. The hotel was not just a vault, it was a mint. As day bled into night, the hotel's character shifted. The sterile efficiency of the business day gave way to the curated chaos of celebration. The sound of jazz, raw and alive, would drift up from the ballroom, a siren call to the city's elite. Inside, an impossible mingling took place. Movie stars from Hollywood drank champagne with hitmen from Cicero. City aldermen clapped the backs of union bosses with extortion rackets. Reporters, their notebooks put away, accepted drinks from the very man they were meant to be investigating. These gatherings were the empire's most sophisticated weapon. They were not parties, they were theatrical productions of power. By offering his hospitality and his illegal liquor, Capone was demonstrating his control over the very fabric of society. He was the host of a world where the lines between law and crime, celebrity and notoriety, had been completely erased. To accept his invitation was to acknowledge his sovereignty. To drink his whiskey was to become, in some small way, complicit in his reign. He moved through these crowds with a performer's grace. His smile was broad, his handshake firm, his custom-tailored suit a beacon of prosperity. He was the generous benefactor, the misunderstood businessman, the charismatic rogue. But behind the performance, his mind was a cold engine of analysis. He watched who spoke to whom, noted the tremor in a judge's hand, listened for the hint of fear or ambition in a politician's voice. Every interaction was a transaction, every conversation a quiet interrogation. This duality was mirrored in the building itself. While the music swelled and glasses clinked in the ballroom, the business of the empire continued unabated on the floors above. A phone call could be made from a quiet office that would dispatch a team of men with machine guns, their mission planned with the same cool detachment as the seating chart for the party below. The hotel contained both the glittering facade of power and the brutal, unseen mechanics that made it possible. The sound of the celebration was the perfect camouflage for the sound of the machine. Here, the city's corruption found its physical center. In discreetly booked rooms, far from the main festivities, the real work was done. Envelopes of cash were exchanged for judicial leniency. Contracts were awarded based on fealty, not merit. Political campaigns were funded with the profits of prostitution and gambling. The Lexington was the marketplace where Chicago's soul was bought and sold piece by piece, in transactions that were never recorded, but whose effects were felt on every street corner. The very architecture of the place held this contradiction. The opulence of the public spaces was a constant distraction from the fortress hidden within. Guests marveled at the chandeliers and the polished brass, unaware of the steel-plated doors just one floor up, or the secret passages that snaked through the walls like veins. Even Capone, standing in the middle of his own party, was never far from an escape route, a hidden switch, a way to seal himself away from the world he so thoroughly commanded. Slowly, imperceptibly, the fortress began to reshape its creator. The total control he exercised over his environment began to feed a deeper, more insatiable paranoia. The walls that were built to protect him from his enemies also began to isolate him from reality. He started to see threats everywhere, in the face of a new bellhop, in a car that idled too long on the street below. The building, his greatest tool of control, was becoming the incubator of his deepest fears. His world shrank to the dimensions of the hotel. Trips out into the city became rarer, more heavily guarded affairs. The fortress was no longer just a strategic choice. It had become a psychological necessity. Why venture into the unpredictable chaos of the streets when he had created a perfect, hermetically sealed universe of his own? The Lexington was his kingdom, his office, and now his gilded cage. He was an emperor who had become a prisoner of his own palace. The hotel staff were the silent, invisible inhabitants of this cage. They were chosen for their discretion and their ability to become part of the furniture. They saw the briefcases of cash, the late-night visitors with grim faces, the fear in the eyes of powerful men. They knew the hotel's secrets, its hidden rhythms and its dark undercurrents. Their silence was the mortar that held the fortress together, a loyalty purchased with high wages and the unspoken threat of absolute violence. The soundscape of the hotel was a symphony of controlled power. It was the contrast between the raucous laughter from the ballroom and the dead, soundproofed silence of an interrogation room. It was the deferential murmur of a clerk at the front desk and the sharp, authoritative snap of Capone's voice cutting through a meeting. It was the constant, low hum of a building operating at peak efficiency, every part working in perfect, terrible harmony. And beneath it all lay the hotel's darkest function. Legends persisted about the labyrinthine basement, about rooms that were never cleaned, because they were never meant to be entered again. The constant flow of people in a hotel provided the perfect cover for making certain individuals disappear. A rival who overstepped, a traitor who talked too much. They could be brought into the Lexington and simply cease to exist, their absence absorbed into the building's thick, silent walls. At this moment, the illusion of permanence was total. Capone, looking out from his fifth-floor window, saw not a city but a dominion. He had built an empire that seemed as solid and enduring as the terracotta facade of his hotel. He had corrupted the system so thoroughly that he had become the system. The idea of a fall was unthinkable, a logical impossibility. The fortress was impregnable, the reign eternal. The sensory world of Suite 530 was the epicenter of this illusion. The rich aroma of his cigar, the heavy feel of a silk robe against his skin, the cold, smooth surface of the gold-plated bathtub fixtures, these were the textures of invincibility. It was a carefully constructed reality designed to insulate him from the brutish nature of his work and the ever-present possibility of a violent end. Here, surrounded by his chosen comforts, he was not a gangster. He was a king. The hotel had successfully seceded from the United States. It operated under its own laws, enforced by its own army. It had its own foreign policy, conducted in meetings with the heads of other criminal syndicates. It had its own treasury, overflowing with untaxed wealth. To step across the threshold of the Lexington was to leave one country and enter another, a nation of one, with a single unwritten constitution, the will of Al Capone. From his perch, the city below became a beautiful, distant abstraction. The headlights of the cars on Michigan Avenue were like jewels scattered on black velvet. The sounds of the street were a muted roar, the soundtrack to a world he no longer needed to touch. He was a master puppeteer, and the city was his stage. He could pull the strings from the comfort of his suite, watching the drama unfold from a safe and superior distance. This profound detachment was the source of his power, but it was also the seed of his destruction. Insulated by layers of bodyguards, concrete, and his own mythology, he could no longer accurately gauge the world outside his fortress. He failed to sense the growing public outrage, the shift in the political winds, the slow, methodical work of a few federal agents who were not interested in his guns, but in his receipts. The system was perfect, the mechanism flawless. The money flowed, the parties glittered, and the enemies vanished. The fortress on South Michigan Avenue stood as a testament to a power so complete, it seemed to have transcended the normal rules of cause and effect. It was the high, silent point of the trajectory, a moment of perfect, terrifying equilibrium before the first invisible crack appeared in the foundation. The first crack was not in the terracotta facade of the Lexington, but in the cold air of a North Side garage. The echo of machine gun fire on St. Valentine's Day 1929 was more than the sound of a gangland execution. It was the sound of a strategic blunder. The massacre was too loud, too public, too brutal. It violated the unwritten code of the underworld, but more importantly, it crossed an invisible line in the public consciousness. The act was a spectacle of such calculated savagery that it ripped away the carefully constructed mask of the benevolent businessman, revealing the sociopathic skull beneath. Overnight, the myth of Al Capone, the charming rogue who gave the people what they wanted, curdled into the reality of public enemy number one. The public, once tolerant or even amused by his antics, was now horrified. The pressure on Washington became immense, a national outcry that could no longer be ignored or bought off with local bribes. An empire that thrived on a certain level of public complicity had, in one bloody morning, lost its most crucial asset, the illusion of being a necessary evil. Within the walls of the Lexington, the news was received not with panic, but with a defiant arrogance. The fortress mentality had taken hold so completely that its occupants believed themselves immune to the shifting tides of public opinion. They saw the massacre as a decisive corporate merger, a final bloody consolidation of the market. They failed to understand that the rules of the game had just been rewritten and that a new, more formidable opponent was about to enter the field. The first federal response was the one Capone expected. Elliot Ness and his untouchables launched a campaign of high-profile raids, smashing breweries and intercepting liquor shipments. It was a war of attrition fought with axes and bullets, a familiar language of violence and disruption. But this was a diversion, a noisy and theatrical battle that drew attention away from the real assault, which was being waged in silence, not with armored cars but with adding machines. The true threat came from a place Capone had never considered a battlefield, the United States Treasury Department. It was an enemy that did not seek to destroy his speakeasies, but to dissect his balance sheets. The war would be won not by the agent with the fastest gun, but by the accountant with the most patience. This was a form of combat for which the fortress on South Michigan Avenue offered no defense. Its steel shutters could stop a bullet, but they could not stop a subpoena. Leading this quiet campaign was a forensic accountant named Frank J. Wilson, a man whose mind saw not a criminal empire, but a fraudulent enterprise with a massive, undeclared tax liability. He did not care about the murders or the bootlegging, only the money. His investigation was an autopsy of the outfit's finances, a slow, methodical search for the paper trail that he knew must exist. He was hunting for the empire's ghost, the documented proof of its illicit wealth. As Wilson's investigation deepened, the atmosphere inside the Lexington began to change. The confident hum of a thriving corporation was slowly replaced by a low thrum of anxiety. The fortress, once a symbol of untouchable power, began to feel like a containment vessel. Surveillance became a constant, unseen pressure. Unmarked cars idled on Michigan Avenue for hours. New faces at the hotel bar were scrutinized with a new intensity. The walls, once a shield, were beginning to feel like the perimeter of a cage. Capone's own paranoia, long a strategic asset, began to curdle into a debilitating liability. The circle of trust, already small, shrank to a suffocating pinpoint. He saw potential traitors in the faces of his most loyal lieutenants. The lavish parties became less frequent, their boisterous energy replaced by a strained, watchful tension. The master of the city was becoming a prisoner in his own throne room, haunted by the fear that the enemy was no longer just outside the gates, but had already breached the walls. This fear was not unfounded. The immense pressure from the federal government began to fracture the code of silence that held the outfit together. Investigators found men on the periphery of the organization, bookkeepers and clerks, whose loyalty could be broken with threats of long prison sentences. For the first time, insiders began to talk, offering small, coded clues that pointed the way toward the financial heart of the empire. The fortress was designed to repel a physical assault, but it was defenseless against a betrayal whispered in a federal interrogation room. The secret passages and armored doors were useless against an enemy who was not trying to get in, but was already there, hidden in the mind of a trusted employee. The building's elaborate security could monitor phone calls and search visitors, but it could not detect a thought of self-preservation. The key to the kingdom, Wilson knew, was not a hidden vault filled with cash, but a simple book of accounts. The greatest weakness of Capone's corporate structure was its own efficiency. An empire of that scale could not be run on memory alone. It required ledgers, receipts, and records. Somewhere within the Lexington's corporate offices, the entire criminal enterprise was documented, its profits and losses meticulously tracked. These ledgers were the empire's true biography, a secret history written in numbers. They detailed the profits from every gambling den, the payroll for every corrupt official, the revenue from every brothel. They were the source code of Capone's power. And as investigators slowly closed in, these documents, once the tools of absolute control, transformed into a time bomb ticking at the heart of the fortress. The great irony was that Capone's own vanity became the prosecution's most powerful weapon. His flamboyant lifestyle, his custom suits, his armored car, his opulent suite at the Lexington, all of it was public, undeniable evidence of an income vastly greater than the one he claimed on his tax returns. He had built a monument to his wealth, and now that monument was to be his tombstone. His success was the very thing that would prove his criminality. The cracks were now visible to those inside. The flow of cash began to stutter as federal raids disrupted the supply lines. Key lieutenants were arrested, creating power vacuums and internal strife. The sense of invincibility that had once permeated the hotel's corridors was evaporating, replaced by the cold realization that the system was, in fact, vulnerable. The hotel itself seemed to absorb this tension. The thick carpets that once muffled the footfalls of power now seemed to swallow sound, creating a heavy, oppressive silence. The panoramic view from Suite 530, once a vista of a conquered kingdom, now looked like a map of an ever-shrinking world, a territory from which there was no escape. The walls were no longer just a shield, they were a boundary. Capone, who once moved through Chicago as its true owner, now found himself confined to his gilded cage, a monarch ruling over an empire that was being dismantled from the outside in. The fortress had held, but the ground beneath it was giving way. The facade of the Lexington still stood, a proud and defiant face turned toward the city. But inside, the structure of power was failing. The pressure was building, the internal supports were groaning, and the silence was that of a building holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment of collapse. The final assault was coming, not with the roar of a machine gun, but with the quiet rustle of a court summons. The end did not arrive with the chatter of a machine gun or the explosion of a rival's bomb. It came with the quiet, authoritative knock on a door that was never meant to be answered by the law. The assault on the fortress was not a siege, but a bureaucratic procedure. Men in dark suits, their faces impassive and their movements economical, presented a piece of paper. This document, a federal search warrant, was a weapon more potent than any Tommy gun, for it carried the weight not of a rival gang, but but of an entire nation that had finally lost its patience. They crossed the threshold of the grand lobby, not as guests or supplicants, but as a new and absolute authority. The opulent space, designed to intimidate visitors and project an aura of untouchable power, seemed to shrink in their presence. The hotel's remaining staff froze, their practiced deference turning to a stark, silent fear. The air, once thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive perfume, was suddenly sterile, charged with the cold ozone of federal power. The Lexington was no longer a sovereign territory, it was an occupied one. Capone's bodyguards, men chosen for their loyalty and their capacity for sudden, brutal violence, were rendered impotent. They stood by, their hands conspicuously empty, as the agents moved past them. Their authority, which extended to every corner of Chicago's underworld, stopped at the edge of the federal warrant. They were soldiers of a fallen kingdom, watching as a foreign power began the methodical process of dismantling their capital. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and the dawning, humiliating realization of their own irrelevance. The ascent in the ornate elevators was silent and heavy. The agents did not speak. Their focus was absolute. As they rose past the floors that still maintained a pretense of being a public hotel, they were moving toward the heart of the empire, the private domain that had been hermetically sealed from the outside world. This was not a raid. It was a surgical extraction, an operation to remove a malignant tumor from the body of the city. The steel-plated door to Suite 530, the very symbol of the fortress's impregnability, was not battered down. It was opened. The agents entered the lavender and green sanctuary, their dark suits a stark intrusion against the soft, decadent palette of the room. The space, designed to be a king's throne room and a paranoid's bunker, was instantly transformed into something else, a crime scene. Its luxury was no longer a sign of status, but an exhibit of illicit gains. The methodical dissection began. While some agents stood guard, others started a slow, meticulous search that was more like an archaeological dig than a police raid. They did not ransack the suite, they unmade it. Paintings were lifted from the walls not to be admired but to be checked for hidden safes. The plush Persian rugs were rolled back, their intricate patterns inspected for the telltale lines of a hidden floor compartment. Every surface was examined, every piece of furniture scrutinized. The agents tapped on the plaster walls, listening for the hollow sound that would betray a secret passage or a hidden cavity. The architecture of paranoia, so carefully designed to protect its master, was now being systematically deconstructed, its secrets probed by the cold, impartial hands of the law. The hotel was being forced to give up the dead it had held in its walls. The search spread from the suite to the adjacent corporate offices. The engine room of the empire fell silent as agents methodically emptied filing cabinets and desk drawers. The teletype machines, which had once transmitted orders for death and deliveries of illegal liquor, were catalogued as evidence. The tools of a vast criminal enterprise were being reduced to inventory tags. They were not looking for guns, though they found them. They were not looking for cash, though it was there, bundled in safes behind false panels. They were hunting for something far more dangerous, something Capone had come to fear more than a rival's bullet. The truth written in ink. They were looking for the ledgers, the paper trail that would connect the man in the silk robe to the river of dirty money that flowed through his fortress. The hidden compartments, once a source of security, now became liabilities. A false back in a wardrobe, designed as an escape route, yielded a cache of documents. A hollowed-out section of wall behind a bookshelf, intended to store weapons, contained a stack of account books. The hotel's own secret anatomy was betraying its master, offering up the very evidence that would ensure his destruction. The climax of the raid was not a shootout in a corridor, but a quiet moment of discovery in a dusty, forgotten corner of a back office. An agent, running his hand along the base of a heavy steel filing cabinet, felt a slight give. A hidden drawer, cleverly built into the cabinet's plinth, slid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the books. They were unremarkable objects, simple accounting ledgers filled with columns of figures and coded notations. Yet in the silent, tense atmosphere of the raided office, they felt like a sacred text. Here was the secret history of the empire, its profits and losses, its bribes and payrolls, all meticulously recorded. It was the Rosetta Stone of the Chicago outfit, and it would translate Capone's wealth into a prison sentence. In that moment, the Lexington Hotel died. Its power was not in its brick and mortar, but in the secrets it kept. With the ledgers seized, the building was exorcised of its authority. It was no longer a fortress, a palace, or a capital. It was just a building, a hollowed-out shell filled with expensive furniture and the ghosts of a power that had evaporated. The raid had not destroyed the structure, but it had ripped out its soul. The agents departed as quietly as they had arrived. They left behind a scene of orderly violation. The rooms were not wrecked, but they were exposed, their secrets laid bare. They carried with them evidence boxes filled with the paper heart of the empire. The immense, terrifying power of the Chicago outfit had been condensed into a few cardboard containers, to be catalogued and presented to a jury. The fortress on South Michigan Avenue was left in a profound and unnerving silence. The hum of the criminal enterprise was gone. The corridors, once arteries of power, were now just empty hallways. The view from Suite 530 was the same, but the city it overlooked was no longer a kingdom. It was a world from which its former ruler was now permanently exiled. The raid was a public execution of a myth. The news spread through the city like a shockwave, undoing years of carefully cultivated fear and folklore. The untouchable had been touched. The impregnable fortress had been breached not by an army, but by accountants with badges. The empire had not been conquered. It had been audited to death. The physical structure would stand for decades more. But its life as a symbol of power was over. It had been reduced to a piece of real estate, a silent, hulking witness to its own fall from grace. Its walls, which had absorbed the whispers of conspiracy and the plans for murder, now held only the memory of their own violation. The fall of this concrete titan raises a haunting question. Does true power reside in the fortresses we build, with their armored walls and secret passages, or in the simple, undeniable truths that can bring them all to ruin? If exploring the anatomy of power and its inevitable collapse fascinates you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of empires and their final days. The man who built the fortress was sent to a different kind of institution, one whose walls were not of his own design. In the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Alphonse Capone was no longer an emperor but a number, stripped of his silk suits and his entourage. The architect of a parallel government found himself subject to the absolute, impersonal authority of another. The silence of his cell was a world away from the controlled hum of his Michigan Avenue command center, a stark and final testament to the limits of his power. His journey into darkness continued, taking him to the cold, wind-swept rock of Alcatraz. Here, the physical confinement was mirrored by a more terrifying internal decay. The neurosyphilis that had lain dormant for years began its final inexorable assault, methodically dismantling the brilliant, brutal mind that had once held a city in its thrall. The man who had built an empire on organizational genius was losing the ability to organize his own thoughts. His fortress of consciousness was crumbling from within. Released 8 years later, he was a ghost of himself, a shambling, incoherent figure who spent his final years fishing in the placid waters of his Florida estate. The king was in exile, his mind a ruin. He died in 1947, not from a rival's bullet in a Chicago alley, but from a stroke in the quiet of his own home. The roar of his reign had faded into a pathetic, incomprehensible murmur. The myth had consumed the man, leaving only an empty shell behind. Back in Chicago, the Lexington Hotel began its own parallel descent. Without its master, the building lost its gravitational center. The dark energy that had once pulsed through its corridors dissipated, leaving a vacuum. The fortress, stripped of its purpose, began the slow, undignified process of surrender. It became an architectural echo of its fallen owner, a hulking, vacant structure, haunted by the memory of a power it no longer possessed. Through the decades, its identity fractured. It changed names, each new moniker a failed attempt to exorcise the ghost of its past. It devolved into a seedy residential hotel, then a brothel, its Gilded Age elegance buried under layers of grime and neglect. Its grand lobby, which had once witnessed the transactions of an empire, now saw only the quiet desperation of the city's forgotten souls. The building was decaying in public, its ruin a slow unfolding spectacle. By the 1980s it was a corpse, a 10-story carcass of brick and terracotta, its windows gaping like the vacant eyes of a skull. The wind howled through its empty corridors, carrying the scent of damp rot and forgotten lives. It stood as a silent, decaying monument, not to power, but to its absolute absence. It was a physical manifestation of a story that had ended, but whose remains refused to be buried. This architectural ghost was granted one last farcical encore. In 1986, television cameras descended, promising to unlock the building's final secret. A sealed vault had been discovered in the basement, and a live broadcast invited a nation to witness its opening. For 2 hours, suspense was manufactured. The promise of a gangster's hidden treasure dangled before millions. It was a final attempt to find substance within the ruin, but as the dust from the demolition charge settled, the great revelation was one of profound, almost poetic emptiness. The vault contained nothing more than dirt, a few broken bottles, and the debris of its own construction. The sanctum of America's most notorious criminal was a void. This televised anticlimax became the perfect, devastating metaphor for the entire empire, a grand performance built around a hollow core. After the cameras left, the hotel was returned to its silence and its fate. The empty vault had been its final, pathetic punchline. There were no more secrets to seek, no more legends to chase. The building was now just an obstacle, a dangerous relic occupying valuable real estate. Its story had been exhausted, its symbolic capital spent. The end came in 1995, not with a whisper, but with the methodical crunch of the wrecking ball. The fortress was unmade, floor by floor, walls that had absorbed the whispers of conspiracy, floors that had supported the weight of absolute power, and secret passages that promised escape were all reduced to a mountain of rubble. The physical evidence of an era was systematically pulverized and hauled away. Today, on that stretch of South Michigan Avenue, there is an absence. The ground where the Lexington once stood is flat, anonymous, absorbed back into the city's indifferent grid. The monument to invincibility has vanished completely, leaving not even a scar on the landscape. The fortress exists only as a phantom, a story of a power so immense it managed to erase itself from the physical world. Was the empire then ever truly made of concrete and steel, or was it always just an illusion? A terrifying performance staged within walls that were destined to fall. When a monument built on fear is turned to dust, and the mind of its builder dissolves into nothing, what truly survives the fall? If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.